Welcome to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana Amay and
Jackie Sanders. We're two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
We talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday.
And on today's episode, we are really excited to welcome author Liza Roberts. So welcome, Liza.
Thank you very much for having me.
Liza is a journalist in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is the founding editor and general manager of Walter Magazine, a graduate of Hamilton College and Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, and spent several years covering business news for Bloomberg News, CNBC, and CBS Market Watch before focusing on art and culture and founding a magazine that showcased it. While covering art for Walter, she became convinced that a book about the remarkable contemporary art of our state was long overdue, and she is honored to have had the opportunity to write it. The Art of the State, Celebrating the Visual Art of North Carolina, was released this fall and is a beautiful and informative volume that illustrates the vitality and importance of North Carolina's contemporary art scene, showcasing the creation, collection, and celebration of art in all its richness and diversity. So as Adriana said, thank you so much, Liza, for being on the podcast today and being able to share your book with the world. It is absolutely gorgeous.
Thank you very, very much.
So how does it feel to have it officially out of your mind, off the computer, and in physical form?
Feels great. It feels so exciting. I have to tell you, it's been, as you both know, it's been a few years in the works. And so it's really thrilling to have the opportunity to share the story now. It's something that I've been feeling is such an important story to tell, to have the opportunity now to share it via the book and through talking to people about the book. So thank you for allowing me the opportunity to do some of that here today.
No, and thank you. We learned about the book. You did an early talk over in ArtSpace several months back as part of the Fresh series of exhibitions and art events and activities that were happening at ArtSpace. So we got to sit in, and I mean, it was a wonderful conversation. And you had several of the artists from the book that were there as part of a panel discussion. So that's actually how we got to learn about you as an author, as a book author, not just as a person working with Walter, for Walter, in Walter, all the things Walter. But that's how we got to learn about this book project and kind of like some of the things that were involved with behind it. So we're actually thanking you because now we are also, as fellow artists, able to discover other artists we may have never heard of that are essentially in our backyard. And you're covering all kinds of different artists. So I don't know, it's very exciting.
Well, thank you very much. There are so many artists in the state, which of course is the point of the book. But I've had so many people say that to me, people like you who are working artists who say, I didn't even know that this person and that person and the other person were here. And I love their work and we have all this in common. And people are kind of meeting each other in a way through learning through the book, but in a similar way that your podcast is connecting people and welcoming newcomers in and showcasing the breadth and depth of talent and certainly in this region, but across the state too.
Yes. And thank you so much. Sharing the kind words before we got on the recording today really do mean a lot to Adriana and I. And especially, I was very excited to get my hands on your first copy of the book this week, especially as Adriana said, starting from the artist talk this spring, and now it's actually coming to life. Buying it at the North Carolina Art Museum, celebrating you and the museum has been an absolute treat. Especially a good resource for artists of learning also that rich history of North Carolina, whether you were born here, which I'm sure we'll dive into, whether artists were born here, they've been transplants here in recent years. I think really diving into that rich history of the relationship between the state and the art is super, super great for everyone to learn about. But diving a little bit into your history before we get into the book, we are curious, did you know that you always wanted to be a journalist? And how did you get involved with the arts in terms of your journal focus?
Yeah. Well, I actually have always known that I wanted to be a journalist. From the time I was very young, I was always really curious and I love to read. So I read every newspaper and magazine. I always had a lot in the house growing up. And I knew that I wanted to be somebody who had the opportunity to go and explore different places and new experiences and meet people and ask them lots of questions. And you got kind of a free pass to be curious when you're a journalist. You get to just introduce yourself to people and ask them questions. It's an amazing sort of paths. You just get to do that. And it's what I wanted to do. I love to write. And so the combination of being able to and encouraged to go learn about things and ask questions and then write about it, that was a combination that spelled journalist. And so I knew that that's what I wanted to do from a very young age. I started really in high school for my not my high school paper. We didn't have a high school paper actually when I was there. I think they do now, but for my local newspaper, I grew up in Pasadena, California. And so the Pasadena Star News, it was and is our local paper. And I was a summer intern, and they were short staffed, and they let me write all these feature stories, and I was completely hooked. I think one of them was on the front page one day, and I thought that was basically everything. Everything was downhill from there. I then was involved in journalism in college. I was on the college paper. I was the news editor for a while, and then I had a little detour. Actually, I always think it's interesting when you hear about someone's career path to hear about the detours, because I think it's reassuring for young people to know that detours can be really productive and add facets to your life and to where you eventually end up that you would never have predicted or even chosen yourself. But my detour was on Wall Street, and I happened to find the job immediately out of college working for a small money management firm in New York. And it was a great opportunity. I wanted to be in New York. So I took the job as a research analyst, and the job was really to write. The job was to write about stocks and explain to clients, why the investment company was investing, what it was investing in. And so it was really a writing job, but I only did it for 2 years. I knew it wasn't for me in the long run. And I went to journalism school after that. And then when I came out of journalism school, my resume, I'm getting to the art part. My resume was business and journalism. So I made lots of sense to go look for a job in business news. And it was a job market that was really weak at that time. And so I felt really lucky that I had the perfect resume for an entry-level business news journalist job. And so I took that at Bloomberg News and was in business news for about 10 years. Just kind of one thing led to the next. And it was wonderful. I learned tremendous amounts about writing. I learned huge amounts about the basic structure of a story. I mean, I felt after having learned things that I wasn't interested in, didn't really care about, didn't know anything about, that I could become interested and engaged with almost any subject and get curious enough to make it interesting, which was a skill that has, been really useful. But I always loved art. And I'd loved it from the time I was really young. I was exposed to a lot of art as a child. I studied art history in college. I was an art history minor. So, and wherever I went, and lived in lots of places, I always sought out art and loved art museums. So I always knew I wanted to write about art, but I didn't really know how to transition to that. And when my family and I moved to North Carolina in 2006, I started writing about art and culture, freelance writing about art and culture, and I loved it. I suddenly felt like everything I cared about had combined, and I was getting to do the thing I really was excited to do. But then there really were very few venues for these stories because the newspaper was was already shrinking, and there really wasn't a city magazine in Raleigh or an art and culture magazine. So that's when I started Walter, because I wanted there to be a magazine to write for. So that's why I started Walter. So that's a long-winded story about did I want to be a journalist and how did I get involved in writing about art? But that's the answer.
I love it. So one thing that captured my attention of what you just mentioned, and it just it's still resonating with me, is the fact that you said before getting to the art side, you were in the business side first. And I definitely relate with that because I worked in investment finance for over 12 years before making the switch to art. And you're right. Sometimes it will take you kind of like, I think you mentioned it, like a detour. It feels like a detour, but it's almost like a necessary exposure to other areas that then in turn enrich the air or your full experience even more. Like me working in the business sector actually gave me some of the tools that are needed now as a full-time artist in order to actually have a small business. So it's very interesting too. It's like, I bet that there was a lot too on the business side where it just kind of popped over, and then now you get to cherry pick in a way, right? Like what elements from that toolbox, if you can call it that you learned on the business side for over a decade, now you can choose what to put in. And then on top of that, I'm sure getting some of that business exposure helped too when you decided to actually make a magazine.
No, it did, definitely. But I think you're absolutely right. And just in terms of the sort of mental agility that it kind of forces upon you to sort of challenge your brain to work in a different way and to sort of be more linear and to ask questions in a different sort of format. And yeah, then yes, you're right. You learn skills that you can bring them back to a more creative and less straightforward process. And it helps you create some rigor around it and maybe some structure that you might not otherwise have. For me, journalistically, it just made me really, really, really particular and careful about details. You can't get numbers wrong. I mean, needless to say. And so, and I was doing wire service reporting for a while, and you simply can't get anything wrong. So and you also have to be quick. So it's kind of nice to not have to be so quick anymore, but I'm really careful about the facts always. Not that every journalist shouldn't be, but there's just a meticulousness that business journalism requires that I think is it's a really useful tool no matter what kind of story you're telling.
Yeah, well, and also like there can be millions of dollars on the line too if you got that share price wrong on the value of a stock and somebody just put their money in it and it's like,
sure.
I understand. I came from that world, although it was more mutual funds than individual stocks, but it was the same level of attention to detail. Otherwise, there could be error resulting in loss of money. So that's always kind of scary. But bringing it back to the book, how did this book project idea begin, and what was your initial or evolving goal with it when you got started?
So it began while I was reporting and writing for Walter and editing Walter, and I loved interviewing artists and writing about artists. It was always my favorite thing. I think artists, I thought then, and I think even more now, I can't think of anybody more interesting to interview than an artist. They have such depths of thought and experience often, and creativity, needless to say. They're just fascinating people to interview. So when I was doing Walter, I was always cherry picking all the art stories for myself. And we had an artist profile every month. And I tried to write them as much as I could without being really selfish. But as I was doing that, I started realizing that there was this enormous population of incredible visual artists, certainly in the Triangle, which is the Walter sort of area. But beyond it, because, once you start interviewing or reporting about any area, you suddenly become aware of all of the tentacles. And so I would constantly think, oh gosh, I wish we could write about that artist in Charlotte, but we were on the Triangle. I wish we could write about that guy up in the mountains, but we can't because we're just the Triangle. So I knew it was a statewide phenomenon, that there were these visual artists that seemed to me to be really world-class and unique, and that they were really populous and that they were really varied. And I was surprised to be learning this kind of piecemeal on my own because I hadn't heard anybody else say it. I hadn't heard that about North Carolina. I'm not a native North Carolinian, as I mentioned earlier. I was learning everything kind of firsthand. I did know, however, that we were a mecca for writers, right? I mean, got incredible storied literary traditions in North Carolina. I knew that about our music. I knew that about our food. I knew that about our athletics and our incredible, beautiful geographic, mountains and coast and all of it. There's so many things North Carolinians are so proud about, but I'd never heard anybody say, and our visual artists are among the best in the world. And yet I kept teaching myself that through reporting about it. I was like, well, why is nobody talking about this? And I also learned that we had these incredible museums everywhere, really everywhere. There's so many incredible museums in North Carolina. The most obvious one to me right off the bat was the North Carolina Museum of Art. We just spoke about CAM earlier in our conversation before we began. There's so many. Art Space is a wonderful resource. So there were all of these great institutions too. And so I just felt like there was this great story and I really wanted to tell it. And so that's how it began. That's how the idea began. I actually started thinking about writing this book long before I even did it, before I made the first move to do it. I think it was about 2016 when I first started thinking this is a book. And I actually went to UNC Press, just cold. I just kind of emailed them, hi, I'm a stranger, I have this idea. And they said, all right, come talk to us about it. So I did. And I was excited about it, but I didn't have 5 minutes of time to even do that when I was doing Walter. I didn't have a second, and my children were quite little. So I kind of shelved the idea, put it on the back burner, and then warmed it up again like 3 years later. So I think it was 2019 when I went back to them. I said, are you still interested? Because now I can do it. And they were, and I wrote a proposal and really got going in earnest in 2020. And I think you said, what was the goal? Was that part of the question?
Yes.
So the goal was to tell I mean, I think I answered, but the goal was to tell the story that I just saw was this it felt to me like a great untold story, like a scoop, literally, which any journalist is very excited to discover. Some people hear me say that, and I know they think, oh, well, I mean, it's not a scoop. It's just that this was happening. And she's like, but I promise you it's a scoop because it hasn't been told and it needs to be. So I have a huge amount of enthusiasm for the opportunity to share it because it feels to me, I know that it is a story that has not yet been fully appreciated. So.
Well, we definitely appreciate you sharing it. And I'm sure this is probably just like the beginning, if not middle of that conversation, because you're so right. I feel like being in North Carolina, both from an artist perspective myself, but also kind of a similar timeline. I moved here in 2016, had an internship at Cam Raleigh where Bill Phelan, who's also a local artist, was curating an exhibition there, and it featured over 20 different artists. And so as part of my graduate project with Cam, I was like, you know what, let's just research all of the North Carolina artists that are featured in this exhibition. There's over 20 of them. Like interviewed them, visited their studios. And I was like, what a better way to understand the artist's landscape in this state that I've never been to before, really. Didn't know much about. I was like, what better way than from the voices of the artists themselves, and really unpacking that relationship that you also discovered and of course made into your beautiful book of both the celebration of artists that we have here, but also that relationship between the state and the community with our artists, having such amazing museums and opportunities for artists that I feel like in the normal community conversation isn't highlighted all the time, but it is such a rich and exciting place to be for the arts. So with a very small amount of experience with writing in comparison to your extensive history, I am curious though, what that writing process looked like for you compared to your work as the founding editor of Walter Magazine in terms of the timeline, the scope. So what was that writing process like for you?
The writing process was very similar, actually. Sort of journalistically, it was very similar. You start out with an idea of a story that you think is out there. You start trying to report it, research it, talk to everybody you can about it. It doesn't really matter what the story is. The sort of process is the same. It's just bigger, and the geographic scope is obviously much broader. So in comparing it to sort of writing for Walter, again, I guess I just sort of started from the same place. What do I do to begin? How do I learn as much as I can about this subject? Who can I talk to? Everybody I talk to would lead me to a next person to talk to. And it kind of mushroomed out. And I talked to, I think I did more than 200 interviews for the book. I know I did more than, it might have been even, well, I don't know. I forget. I counted it up one time, but then it was a lot. And so you do lots and lots of interviews, and then you try to sort of see the outlines of the story begin to take shape. Again, as I'm saying, as I hadn't really been told before, there wasn't a resource for me to go to or reference materials really. It was, okay, well, it seems like I'm hearing that we were the first in this, and then we were the first in that nationwide. And then nationwide, we also did that first. It seems like North Carolina was doing all these things first. Why was that? You go talk to a bunch more people. Well, here's why. Here's where the money came from. Here's who was interested in making culture grow here. And so it just sort of started to take shape. It was logistically, obviously a lot more complicated than doing Walter, at least just one story for Walter, in that there were so many moving parts, and there were photo shoots to schedule, and it was COVID, and there were images to get from artists of, photographs of their work, because oftentimes an artist will have their work professionally photographed and they want you to use that image. So just even it's very pedestrian, sort of like getting those images that are resolution and having them logged and having them fully credited. And there's just lots and lots of details to nail down. So logistically, it was thorny. I did have a great assistant who helped me, Tennessee Woodgill. She was great. And we kind of plowed through. But I'll say something too about something that you mentioned earlier, Jackie, which was the stories of individual artists, sort of the people who they are. And you wrote about them at CAM, and you felt like it brought a lot of light to the exhibit that Bill was putting together. Mm-hmm. I think that is a really important piece of appreciating art, visual art, for a lot of people, because unlike other forms of art, like music, which kind of comes out and grabs you and fills your senses, right? You almost experience music, or you experience a performance, theater performance, or you read a book and you are immersed in the world of the book, right? These are experiences. A painting, you need to go to it, right? It doesn't really come to you. You need to stop and tell yourself to pay attention and ask yourself what it means. And the painting does not come to you unless, once in a blue moon, maybe it'll hit you over the head and you'll be wowed by something. But by and large, I think the reason why somebody becomes engaged with the work of art, first of all, it's the physical beauty or challenge or message of that work of art that grips a person. But then often it's who made it and why did they make it and how did they make it, the process and the person and who they are and how they came to be who they are and how they came to create what they create. That is what really engages people. And I think that for visual art, more than maybe any other art form, that's a really important piece of the appreciative puzzle. So I think that in terms of the work that went into this, the opportunity to tell those human stories was really thrilling. And I think is part of what makes art come alive and hopefully will engage more people in appreciating our art.
Wow. I absolutely love that. And you're bringing up a good point too, that, many visual artists, at least myself, this was my case coming from the business world, didn't realize that you think, oh, I did this painting and people will kind of get it or will kind of understand it. And it is a language like everything else. Like music is a language, performance is a language. And sometimes you have to help people with writing to understand that language until they get to know you, and then they can sort of kind of translate what you're trying to transmit through the work. But
Yeah.
otherwise, the work itself, with very few exceptions, doesn't have words on it. So they're like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to feel with it or what I'm looking at unless it's extremely representative. Then actually, even then, there might be nuances in it. So I absolutely love that.
Well, can I just say one thing about
Yeah.
that? I think that issue, that what you've just described, is partly why people have not historically embraced the visual art here with as much familiarity and enthusiasm as they have our other art forms. Because I think too often people feel like they need to know, what does it mean? What am I supposed to be seeing? I don't know if I get it. Am I right in that it looks like this? They think that there's a rule book and that there's no right and a wrong, and that if they don't know it, it's not for them. And too often visual art can seem elitist or kind of behind a closed door or a hushed gallery, or it's, you got to be quiet and it's very, you need to have done your homework. And so I think that that's an impediment. And I hope very much that stories like the ones you're telling with your podcast and stories like the one I'm telling with my book kind of tear down that wall a little bit and just show people that these are creative people who are trying to showcase and question and celebrate and every bit of inquiry into the world we're living in today. And what you, the viewer, brings to it is just as important in many cases what the artist is bringing to it. So it's for everybody.
Oh, I agree 100%. It's essentially like, I feel like the paintings or whatever form of artwork it is in many ways a mirror for the viewer. They come to it where they are and they see in it what they'd like to see. Sometimes they'll see, I think my kid could do that. Well, that's on you. Like, the artist had a different thing, and
Right.
you maybe have a different point of view with it, and that's beautiful too. You don't have to like everything. I like to compare a lot of times art to food and say you don't have to like every single food out there or what everybody cooks. It's we all have different tastes, and it's exactly the same thing with art. And you don't, it doesn't have to be behind a wall or a gallery cube situation.
Right.
I mean, it can be open. So I also agree, and I know Jackie does too, with it's so important for us to literally, it's part of our slogan, you could say our mission is to demystify that process and just have that conversation and say, look, part of the reason artists make work is because they're trying to talk to you. They're trying to
Yes.
connect with you, communicate with you.
Right.
And sometimes we can't necessarily do it with, sorry, it's kind of cliche to say it this way. We can't say it with words. So we paint it, we create it, we tinker it, we fire it in a kiln and make ceramic stuff, whatever that looks like for everybody.
And the fact that it is its own language and it is a form of communication makes it all the more interesting to try to write about it.
Yes.
Or
Yes,
or or describe it in words.
at least try.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do have one little nerdy question real quick. We won't stay on this one too much, just a little nugget here. My brain, right, coming from a left side brain kind of things, the business world, there is one little thing that I do want to ask you about, and it's regarding logistically, right? You did mention a lot of it is the same doing a magazine versus doing a book, but was there anything that helped you stay organized? So something that has so many deadlines and time frames and so many moving parts. And I'm asking because artists a lot of times might be, maybe it's not a writing project, but they may have a big exhibition that they want to put, or maybe a big project that they want to collaborate with someone. And just the idea of this giant rock looming over them, they're like, I don't know how to break this down. So, do you have any quick tips or anything on how you were able to wrangle this giant project, or
Yeah.
any technology, anything?
Good question. Well, yes, I have a couple thoughts about that. I mean, it's like one thing at a time, right? I mean,
Okay.
it's like that. But I think what I would do, what I did is I think you used the words reverse engineer in one of our sidebar conversations. And I did do that. So I looked at my deadlines and I went back and I said, okay, this mountain is due on this date. And that means I've got 3 months. And so how long is it going to take me to do one unit of it, whatever that may be, and where's the time in my calendar in that 3 month period where I'm going to, and then I was religious about it. So if I was supposed to if I was supposed to conduct an interview on a certain day, obviously that was scheduled, so I do it, but I would also schedule when was I going to write that profile. And I allowed myself to write the chapters after I'd written all the profiles and all the sidebars, because I knew that in going back through all of my notes for those individual profiles and sidebars, that threads that I could weave into the chapters themselves I would be reminded of them as I went. So I think that was a good and useful way for me to do it. The chapters I wrote completely separately. So just for the listener, the book is organized in 6 chapters, and it's sort of a through line chapter. Like, here you are in the mountains. Here's how art gets made there and why. And here's a little bit of history and context. Here are some of the institutions and the people who support and create that ecosystem in the mountains. And then separately, here are a dozen or 2 dozen artists who illustrate the breadth and depth of the art being made in that place. So when I say the chapters, I mean that through line part about the mountains or the triad or the triangle. So yes, I reversed engineered it. I stayed religious to my deadlines. There were times when I couldn't, and then I would really be very strict and make myself pile it up until I caught back up. And I never really did get behind. Technology, I would say, yes. I'm kind of a technophobe, and I'm not proud of it. It's not something I think is like a badge of honor at all. I think it's a weakness. But anyway, I use this amazing resource called rev.com, which is, do you all know it? It's a transcription service. It would be very useful to both of you, I think, in the course of what you're doing. So it's an AI driven transcription service. So you record with your phone, or you could record on the computer with their app, and then they transcribe it immediately as soon as you send in that file. They'll transcribe it using AI, so it's imperfect, but they send you the transcription within minutes, and then you can click on the text, and it will play back that portion. So I was just double checked. I got the gist, and I took my own notes, longhand as well. But then I could go back to the transcription and say, okay, that's where he says this thing. I click on it, and if there was a missing word because AI missed it, I'd fill it in. But it was amazing to have the interview transcribed and then be able to just click on the actual typewritten words and hear those words spoken. And without that, I don't know if I could have written the book, frankly. I mean,
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing, both for, conversations over Zoom, or I'm even thinking, of course, as artists who many may be resistant to technology or prefer handwriting, whether it's brainstorming artist statement or brainstorming just an explanation of a project. If you're handwriting it, then okay, read it out loud, see how it sounds, while also it's transcribed for your website or for a newsletter or whatever it may be, even in the short form. But especially for those long form interviews, that's a super great insight.
It is great. And it's pretty inexpensive too. They have a transcription service whereby a human being does the transcribing. That's very expensive. But if you do the AI one I've described, I think it's like $15 for an hour of audio.
Oh,
pretty good. And then the thing that I would also say about the longhand versus technology, both. Why does it have to be either or? I took plenty of longhanded notes, and if somebody was kind of saying something, I knew that I was getting recorded, and I knew, and didn't need to. I would say like jeans, plaid shirt, all the things that I didn't think I had time to write down because they were talking. They're just what their studio looked like, and then both things can happen. You can get a lot done longhand, and then you can also have these magical tools helping you transcription wise. That was huge.
Yeah. And I'm sure while you were having those conversations, it's one thing to get the exact quote or the dates or names of exhibitions and things like that from the artists. But
Yeah.
of course, as a journalist, you have that ear and that brain to pick up on other cues of, oh, like you're thinking about previous interviews of, oh, this could be a great tie-in. Let me put these profiles together. So also actively taking notes while you're in that conversation and still engaged, but
Yes.
setting your future self up for success of coming to the table and having some of those ideas documented too.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so, with having all these conversations, of course, there are a lot of creative voices out there. So, I am curious, what was that criteria that you used to select the artists that were featured in the book?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's the question I get asked almost most often, and by almost everybody, and it's makes sense. Because I mean, where do you start? I mean, you both know there's just an amazing number of very talented and fascinating people out there. So what I did was my mission, my goal was to showcase the diversity and the breadth and the depth, and of course the excellence of visual art being made in North Carolina today. And so I looked at it really kind of top down. I knew that the book was going to be so long. I knew that I would have a chance to feature so many artists. This was a fact, factored in by how many pages the book could be and how many photographs could be in the book. These are sort of budgetary and publishing types of decisions that were made early. We did fudge it and we did stretch it, but basically I had the building blocks. I could have this many artists. I could have this many photographs. All right. So now how am I going to showcase all of these different kinds of art and all these different kinds of people? And so I tried to be pretty even-handed with men and women. I tried to be pretty even-handed with types of mediums of, sort of messages and techniques. I wanted to tell really interesting stories. So I was very focused on the human element, as I was just describing, of who these people were. I wanted there to be, Native North Carolinians. I wanted there to be immigrants. I wanted there to be people who had come to study and stayed because it was so wonderful. I wanted people who grew up here and never wanted to leave. I wanted people who'd moved from New York because New York was too expensive and they were world-class artists. And they wanted to come here because this was where they could spread out. This was where they could have a community. This is where they could be a human being and therefore afford to make art. So I wanted lots of different kinds of stories. I wanted lots of different, you'd be surprised at how similar sometimes a story can be. Well, I grew up this way and I ended up this way, but you need to have all different kinds. So I did as much research as I could ahead of time, and sort of about people's backgrounds and sort of the story of how they, got a toehold of success so that I would even have heard of them. And then I tried to make sure that I showcased the diversity in every aspect. So, I mean, I've said this before, but I could probably have written this book 10 times over with totally different artists, and it would have been exactly the same caliber of art. There are so many artists. This is the tip of the iceberg. One strict criteria I had was they had to be living and working in North Carolina.
Okay.
There were a couple of artists who I would have loved to have included, who had left North Carolina. As it turns out, temporarily. I didn't know that at the time. They've come back, and I sort of think, oh gosh, if I'd known you're coming back, I would have talked to you about this. But that just points out how many there are. There's so many great ones. I don't know if it answers your question. It's kind of vague, but it was really just, how do I show how deep, rich, wide, and interesting this is?
Yeah, you can always do volume 2, 3, 4.
Yeah,
The same. Expanded edition. You never know. But one thing that I'm curious about, because I mean, I imagine you have a certain number of artists, of course. You're going to research as much as you can. So either during the research phase or when you got to meet with them and got to talk to them one-on-one, were there any artists that you were really surprised by?
I was surprised by almost everybody. I have to say, because as I say, artists are such fascinating people, and they have so much to say, and they really, almost by definition, they're very thoughtful, right? And so there's still rivers run deep. There's a lot there if you listen long enough. And Lissa Gottwald's the wonderful photographer who took the pictures in the book. She and I would go to these places, and half the time we would know this much about what we needed to know, because that's how much I had. These were people not always written about very much, and we didn't really know what their studio would look like, and we had to kind of learn it from scratch. So surprise was kind of a common element, but I would say that one artist who comes first to mind when you ask that question is this incredible artist on the coast, Christina Lorena Weisner. She lives in Kitty Hawk, and I think what surprised me so much about her, I knew her work was environmental. I had seen some of it. She'd exhibited at the Greg in Raleigh, and so I knew what her art was, but I hadn't really heard much about her as a person. I knew she was a young woman, and that's about as much as I knew about her. And she was so fascinating because her experience with that, her intersection with the natural world informs her art so profoundly that really to be with her is to experience the physical world as a form of art in a way. She makes work that records environmental data. She makes work that floats. It's all about, she makes seismographic work that measures tremors. She's measured wavelengths in the ocean. She's very, very focused on the natural world. And she herself is a former beach lifeguard and competitive swimmer. She's a serious athlete. She runs every day. She talks about the kinesthetic experience of the place that she's going to make art as being vital to her art making. So if she's going to make art about, the waves and, off Kitty Hawk or whatever, something like that, she will run that beach several times at different times of the day for weeks to understand it in her body before she makes her art.
Huh.
And Lissa Gottwals and I went out to Kitty Hawk for the photo shoot, and she had her floating cubes that she had attached to her kayak and come down the Neuse River with hundreds of miles. And she brought them out into Kitty Hawk Harbor, and it was like, it was March. It was not even 6 o'clock in the morning. It was like 42 degrees outside. It was freezing cold. Lissa actually went in the water with her. I got to be freezing on the shore and thought I was a hero, but Lissa was actually in the water. Anyway, Christina had put on her wetsuit. She was completely unbothered by the weather and put together all of her art. It was all kind of, needed to be assembled, and just walked out into this freezing ocean. And the whole thing was part of her art. Like, she just is indomitable. She just experiences the earth in a different way. So I didn't anticipate any of that, and I was kind of bowled over by it. I guess that's one example, but there were so many.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. And of course, as fellow artists and understanding more and more about that creative process, I feel like we can all find inspiration, whether you're going into ice cold water at the ocean or just shifting your creative practice to be more intuitive to your schedule or the ebbs and flows of energy throughout the day. Making artwork before the sunrise, after the sunrise are definitely things that I think a lot of people can connect to. And I am curious, that's one artist who's an example of, you were saying she finds a lot of inspiration and energy from the natural environment around her. Kind of piggybacking off of Adriana's question, like, which artist had the most interesting or a notably interesting creative studio space that you visited? And were you able to visit all of the artists that you interviewed? Because it was 2020 when you started this venture.
Yes, it was tricky, but all of the artists who have the full profile of a picture in their studio, and I think there's 67 of them, something like that, 66 or 67. Yes, I did interview all of them in their studio. The artists for whom there's a picture of their artwork, but not a picture of themselves, those were not all in person. Some of those were on the phone, but all the ones where there's a photograph of the artist themselves, yes, I was there for those shoots and interviewed them in person. The studios are so interesting. I just can't. There's nothing more interesting to me than to go into an artist studio and see how the art is made and see the environment that it's made in, and it's so varied. I actually think it's always fascinating. I haven't gone into a boring studio ever. The one that I think was the most kind of I felt kind of pinching myself because it was so extraordinary was an artist named Mel Chin. And he is a conceptual artist. He's a MacArthur Genius Award winner. He's the only MacArthur Genius Award winner who is a visual artist from North Carolina ever. He lives up in the mountains, very, very rural location in Egypt Township, a town called Higgins. It's not a town. There's no town. It's just his house, basically, and a river. He lives in an old 1920s stone mansion that used to be many things. It had a previous life as a maternity hospital. It had life after that as a community sort of gathering place and arts center that was meant to be kind of an economic driver for local crafts. It then had other iterations, and then he bought it when it was abandoned and empty, and he needed a big place to store his work and work there. So it's you basically, it's in the middle of nowhere, and there is this gorgeous kind of statuesque mansion with vines covering it, and there's a house off to the side, and that's where he lives, and that's the former head doctor's house, and he lives there with his wife. And the house itself, the mansion, it is like a factory of studios. And he's got like a film studio and a woodworking studio and a painting studio and a silk screen area, and It's amazing. And then, there was simultaneously a fleet of people making another whole giant warehouse-sized studio for him off to the side, and so this whole compound felt like a kind of like like through the looking glass. It was like a fairy tale, something separate from reality. And he's a MacArthur genius, so I can fairly call him a genius. Talking to him was absolutely fascinating. He's so well and diversely read, and so thoughtful about so many things. And to be with him in that environment, having the conversations that we had, was as special an experience I've had as a journalist as anything. So I think that was probably the most memorable studio.
Wow. Wow, just trying to picture it. My brain's like, yeah, after we're done recording, I'm definitely looking up, some of these folks. That sounds absolutely amazing. Oh my
Very,
goodness.
very interesting man.
Sounds like an artist's paradise there.
Yeah, really. I mean, and so he's not too far from Asheville. And so UNC Asheville students help him sometimes with his work. He had a giant, so in I think it was 2020, don't quote me, it might have been 2019, I think it was 2020. New York City asked him, did a retrospective of his work. And so each of the 5 boroughs had an installation that he created. And he needed to create something for Times Square. He decided to create an installation that would showcase climate change. And so he built a 60-foot tall animatronic sculpture with the help of UNC Asheville students that looks kind of like a whale skeleton, and it also kind of looks like a shipwreck. It's kind of like these ribs, of like could look like the hull of a boat or a whale skeleton. And he built it with these UNC Asheville students, and it was right in the middle of Times Square. And it was in Asheville when Lissa and I were there, but he had built it there at his compound with UNC Asheville students. That's
Wow.
interesting.
Yeah, we'll definitely have to look all this up, and we'll obviously share it with readers too. I mean, with our podcast listeners and or folks that watch on YouTube. So it sounds like through your diligent research, interview, conversations, I mean, all of this that you're having with creatives to write this book, I mean, you must have learned a lot about what the modern, day artist is faced with. So it's not just looking in the past art history type thing. Like, you're actually talking to folks that are currently practicing their craft in this day and age. So with that in mind, what was the biggest challenge as you were like talking to different artists that you see contemporary artists face, and what would your advice be to them?
That's an interesting question. I think that a lot of artists, visual artists, really struggle to make a living. Of course, we talked about this a little bit as an artist, and many, if not most, of the folks that I included in the book also teach because they need and want benefits, and they also love to teach. Many of them, and it keeps them making art. But it's very hard to be a self-supporting working artist with just your art. So I think that's a major challenge. I think for younger artists or artists earlier in their career, the challenge is getting seen and getting traction sort of in the marketplace of art, or even in just the conversation about art. That's hard. Small galleries have been disintermediated in many cases by the internet, by Instagram. In some ways, that's hugely beneficial for artists, but in some ways it also robs them of the sort of champion that a great gallerist can be, connecting them with collectors. So I've seen a lot of gallerists become art advisors. And I think that that's a really interesting role, because the overhead is gone, but the advocacy is there. So I think for a young artist, or an artist, at the beginning of their career, that's a real challenge. How do they get kind of traction? How do they find collectors? How do they reach an audience? And I would say that, when I was looking for artists, and I was really trying to find artists that nobody was telling me about, I didn't want to only include artists that people already knew about. And I believe I did include many artists who were not part of sort of a conversation at a higher level, that they were much more sort of grassroots discoveries. Participating in shows like the one where I met you all, the Fresh show at Art Space, I think you can't you can't overstate how important that might be. There are many artists in this book that I found in shows like that. I was thinking about this the other day. Ivana Milojevic Beck.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
she's wonderful.
She's great. She's amazing. And she's a fellow colleague at Art Space, and now she's at City Market Artist Collective.
Yep.
Yes.
Right. So I saw her piece, one of her pieces at Coined in the South, which is the Mint show. I'm pretty sure it's annual. It might be biannual. That is all Southern artists. And I just went and looked at every single piece of art, and anyone from North Carolina, I looked hard at that work and I thought, is this something that I haven't seen before? Could this have a place in the book? And her work is so singular, right? I mean, wax and bricks and all of the kind of curvaceous forms that she creates out of those two elements is so interesting. So I first saw her there, and then I kind of followed up and I followed her a little bit, saw what she was doing and thought she sounded like her story was really interesting and her work was really, really unique. And so I saw her there. I also found Chieko Murasugi through a very small artist, sort of a community showcase of art in Enfield, which is a small town near Rocky Mount. And I'd been invited up there to see this show by a fellow who organized it. And there were, it was very small, but I just was exploring everything. So I wanted to go see it. And there I saw Chieko's piece and I thought, I think I've seen this work somewhere else. And then, in fact, I've seen it at Coined in the South. So once you start hearing the same name over and over again, if you're a collector or you're a journalist like me, or you're someone like you all and you're looking for subjects, I think that's probably how you find people too. Like, didn't we hear about that person? Should we ask about? So I would encourage artists who are trying to seek that traction or find that audience to submit their work to everything. And to really, I'm sure that not everybody loves Instagram. I know I don't, and I've had to learn how to do it, but to be much better at it. But I think that that's a great tool too. I really do.
I like it. I feel like some of the things that are resonating with me is that idea of it's not a popularity contest, really, and it's not necessarily like if your challenge is to make a career out of this, is essentially you need eyeballs on your work, and for people to find you, it's not just online, because it also depends on the viewer and what platforms they're in, but that a great opportunity, especially for those that maybe, whether they're young or not, emerging artists, is to be in group shows that perhaps some of the participants in them already have followings that are being drawn and already have collectors, and then they get a chance to discover this newer artist too. And essentially spread the love, not just, again, places like the internet and social media and whatnot, but also in person, and then make that connection is the other thing that I'm hearing from what you're saying, is like actually, whether introverted or not, introverts here, is to actually make that effort to network. Because you also mentioned how galleries in the past, and some of them still are, can be advocates, and same thing, they also have exposure to a different kind of audience that an individual artist may not. So it's also creating those links and those connections and talking to people. Honestly, it all really boils down to, well, this has been around for a few thousand years. Go talk to somebody. Make that connection, and then who knows? Somebody that knows somebody that knows somebody, and then they're like, "Ooh, I want to feature you in a book." Ta-da!
Exactly. I really think that that's so true. It's you can't expect to find an audience if people don't even know you're there. And so and you'd be amazed every time I've done an event and had artists on a panel with me, those artists have folks from the audience who seek them out afterward. That's happened 4 times now in a week and a half. So I know that, and those were people who were self-selected to come to an art event, who love art, who are all about North Carolina art, and they hadn't heard about these people. Once they did, then they wanted to know more. So yeah, people can't like something they don't know about.
Exactly. And it's all about engaging in that conversation. I think you even pointed out, Instagram is a great platform, and the empowering aspect of being a modern day artist is you don't necessarily need gallery representation to have your own website, to put your artist statement online. You can do it through social media or your website, but that does also only get you so far. As we've discussed, the history and the richness of the arts community was existing long before Instagram, long before social media. So it's also engaging in that in-person conversation, and especially with visual art, experiencing the work in person. For so many people, there is sometimes a little bit of the magic that's lost when it's condensed down to an image, or you're experiencing it on a backlit phone. A lot of it is about going into a calming room where it's quiet. They don't have noise or a podcast playing in the background, as great as podcasts are, while they're scrolling Instagram, that changes your relationship to what you're looking at. So going into these physical spaces, hearing artists talk about their work can really be a way that your artwork can stand out and engage with people who may not be on Instagram or following you or on your website.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely. And I think if people do meet you and at a, like something like the Fresh exhibit, and I get to say, so Jackie, tell me about your work, and you can explain it to them, then suddenly they have that connection to the work. They're already predisposed to be somebody who might, theoretically be somebody who might collect your work. And then there's a reason for them to want it to come home with them, right? Because they have a story about it and they care about it. I think that's a huge, I've also profiled collectors in the book, and all of the collectors that I interviewed said very similar things about that they were very attached to individual works of art because they know something about the artist. And here's what the artist said to me, and here's how the artist did it. And when I was in the artist studio, this is what she told me. I heard that time and again. It's that connection to the artists themselves. Because the truth is that lots of people believe that artists have a magical ability. They're almost a sort of, it really is. It's a way. It's turning an idea into an object.
Mm-hmm.
It's a transformation that seems, in many ways, impossible to lots of people. And the fact that you all can do it, it's exciting, and people kind of want to get near that. So I think the more that artists can share how that works, the more people are engaged.
Artist magic. We're just going to go with that. We just try to go behind the curtain and show how the trick is done. This is why we do the podcast. But okay, so those are some of the things that are, that can help somebody stand out. Of course, we're covering some of that. But on the flip side of that, is there what is one thing that you've seen artists do that could harm their reputation, other than, hiding away in the studio and never coming out to see the light? Because there's those two. I'm not hating on the hermits. I'm kind of one too. But is there anything that you've seen that you're like, ooh, no, don't? Mm-mm.
It's hard. I don't think so. I think that the only thing I could really think of is just to lie fallow for a long time. There were a couple of artists who I had heard of or I knew of vaguely, and I went to go try to track them down, and they hadn't made any art in a couple of years, and their website didn't have anything new on it. And I just figured they were probably not currently making work. And so I just, there were so many to choose from. What I needed was ways to eliminate people. So if it seemed as if an artist wasn't currently, actively participating in the art world, I didn't really chase them down. There was one person I tried to chase down, and he did not want to be chased. So he didn't want, fair enough. So yeah, I think that I can't imagine anything. Most things that an artist does, if they're interesting, are probably a pretty good idea to do.
Yeah, and that's fair. I heard this comparison the other day. I don't remember where they said the artists trying to talk to their audience, their collectors, to fellow artists. Oh, sorry. It's much like fostering a friendship. And they're like, if you stop talking to your friends, they are like, did I do something? Should I reach out? And much in the same way as an artist who's trying to make a career out of this, it's almost like you stop showing up to work.
Yeah.
What happened? Like, maybe you're still employed, but nobody's heard from you. We haven't seen you in the office for a while.
Right.
You kind of drop off the radar a little bit, but I understand that makes sense too, because sometimes, it's just stages of life as well, where it's like maybe they're taking care of a parent, an aging parent, or a child with some needs and things like that, or a medical situation, and they just kind of have to drop off the radar a little bit. But that is actually a good reminder for those of us that don't always post all the time that we do need to remind others that, signs of life, we're alive and well, we're still making work. Just post a few times.
And I think that brings up that interesting conversation too of what does showing up for your creativity and for your craft mean to you? I feel like for artists that can be so different. It may be making artwork every single day and sharing it with the world in real time. It may be, I'm going to be going into a tunnel vision of studio time for 3 months, 6 months, building a collection. And that might be part of their creative process. Not that they don't peek their head out every once in a while, but they might need that focus time. But they're almost doing the opposite. They're actively so engaged in their creative practice that they might not be posting about things on Instagram, or they have previous collections in exhibitions, but they're building this new body of work. And so it's also figuring that out as artists, what that looks like to you, which kind of brings us to that perfect segue into a question that we ask everyone who's on our podcast is, after talking to all these artists and having an art form yourself with writing, how do you define success as an artist?
I think if I were thinking about visual artists and the people I've been writing about, and both of you, I would say engagement. That if art is a form of language and it's being spoken or used to describe an idea or a question or a matter of significance to you as an artist, then it seems that what you're seeking is engagement. And I think if there are people who engage with your work, then you've succeeded. Whether that's they're interested in it, they're curious about it, they want more of it, they want to collect it, they want to talk about it. I mean, that seems to me to be like the very essence of success.
And as a writer and editor, of course, you have an art form in your own and your own creative practice and journey. So what is one piece of advice that you wish you had heard before you got started on your journey as a writer? What advice would you give yourself?
I think I would give myself the advice that don't expect anybody to come and hand you opportunities. Literally, I think it's very rare that somebody seeks someone out and says, "Hello, I've discovered you in the wilderness, and here's the perfect job, or here's the perfect writing opportunity, or here's the perfect anything." Everything I've ever done that has succeeded is something I created myself, and I think that is it's actually really exciting to know that early on because it means you're in the driver's seat. And I didn't think that way when I was younger. I sort of thought, well, I'll work hard and then I'll get promoted, or then somebody will give me another better job. And it was a much more passive way of looking at things. And I guess I was just younger and just didn't really think that hard about my career arc. But once I started realizing that there were things I wanted to do that I couldn't do, and I was going to have to make them happen myself, then everything started to work the way I wanted it to. So yeah, I think I would just say, create your own opportunities and start now.
Yeah. No, and I love that. And I think that's also really important for artists to hear, regardless of what stage they're in, because if you work for somebody else, most careers, there's already a path, and you have to hit certain milestones to maybe be eligible to be promoted. And then you also have to be assertive enough to ask to be promoted when you deserve to be promoted. So there's like this whole politics, office politics, and things that happen, when you work for somebody else. But when you work for yourself, you also have to realize, whether through the journey or you hit yourself against the wall and then you realize it, that you have to build your own career, especially creative careers. There is no preset way to get from A to B. You have to trailblaze your own way. There is no preset. So I love that you're hammering that in, because I think we need to, drive that point home all the time.
I think artists are natural born entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
You're all creating something out of nothing. You're all taking an idea that only you have and you're making it real. You're all in business for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what an entrepreneur is. So I think artists are entrepreneurs. And part of what I love about talking to artists is that entrepreneurial journey that they go on. I have a unique idea. I don't see anywhere else. I need to make it real. I need to make it happen. I'm going to do it. I did it. Now what am I going to do with that? I'm going to I'm going to spread it. And so how they go about it, it's an entrepreneur's journey. It's really interesting, I think. I don't mean to take away from the artistry and the nuance, but I'm just thinking of it as just sort of an enterprise. It's very entrepreneurial, requires immense independence, creativity, and determination.
Definitely a lot of determination. Yeah. And I think it's like, this could be a podcast episode on its own. That whole idea of like, why are you separating the art from the money when for hundreds, thousands of years, that's how it was done? I'm like, Da Vinci worked on commissions.
Yes.
Why is it not good now? But that's a different story, different rabbit hole. But that's what that made me think of. But speaking of money, hey, there's the tie-in. If someone just hands you $100, what would you splurge it on or invest in? It has to be something that brings you joy and is related to art or business.
Well, I think it would be art. I mean, obviously, I think it would be a very small work of art, probably, or a print or something, or maybe be a book about art. I think it would be something like that for sure. Because I don't think there's anything like art that to bring you lasting energy and happiness and sort of peace and satisfaction in your own home than a work of art can do. There's nothing like that. It can, if there's a work of art that you love that you can kind of get lost in, it changes your entire experience of being there. being in the place where that work of art is. That's really, really valuable. So if there was a work of art that was small enough that could be, that I could buy with that amount of money, I would probably do that.
I absolutely love that. And so, Liza, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. There are definitely way more rabbit holes that we could have gone down, but we appreciate you sharing your experience with us, writing the book, and of course, having this beautiful book now being published. We just want to say congratulations. And how can our listeners stay connected to you after listening to this podcast episode?
Well, thank you very much, Jackie and Adriana. Thank you so much for your questions, and thank you for what you're doing to promote our artists and to give them a platform to share their stories and to get to know each other, and for everyone else to learn about them. I really applaud what you're doing. And I'm really excited to go down all of your rabbit holes that you've already explored with so many other guests. I've started, but I need to do some more. So thank you for all that. Right now, Instagram is the best way to keep in touch with me. I have a website in the works, but I spent all this time working on writing the book, and I didn't think about some of the promotional things until suddenly I needed to think about them. So a website will be happening soon. But in the meantime, my Instagram account is The Art of the State. So the book is Art of the State, but the Instagram is The Art of the State. So
Yeah,
thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. And as we start to wrap this up, a real question, where can our listeners get a hold of this book?
Oh, they can get it in Raleigh at Quail Ridge Books. There's a great bookstore in Southern Pines called the Country Bookstore, and that's another great place to get it. I recommend all independent booksellers. It's also available on Amazon. It's really available anywhere books are sold. It's also at the North Carolina Museum of Art. And I'm excited that I'm going to be there on Sunday signing books. I don't know when this podcast is going out. It might be.
Yes, this will be aired on the Tuesday after that. But I am excited. I got my copy yesterday from the museum, and I will be there on Sunday to get a signing of it. So I'm excited to see you again in person to get my personal copy autographed by you.
Oh, I'm honored. Thank you very much.
That's perfect. And for any upcoming talks and things like that, those are on Instagram then?
Yes.
Perfect.
On Instagram. And yes, I'll be tomorrow. Well, at the point that this is aired, there will also be a recording of another talk I'm doing with Malaprop's bookstore, which is virtual. So that should probably be up by then too. And I'm going to be at the Mint Museum on December 7th for a book signing in Charlotte. So
nice.
Yeah. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity and for this great conversation.
Well, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. Like, this has been amazing. I'm like, we've done a few authors, but this is very cool. So thank you for coming onto the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. And as always, all of our episode notes, as well as links to other podcast episodes, will be in the show notes for today, including museums and artists that we talked about today. And of course, links to contact Liza and get your hands on her beautiful new book, Art of the State, Celebrating the Art of North Carolina.
And if you want to stay connected with Jackie or myself in between episodes, share what you have learned, you can follow us on social media. I'm at May Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. Or if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.